Chapter 78. Mashkil of Asah. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter dark sayings concerning the days of old. That which we have heard and known and our fathers have told us, we will not hide from their children, telling the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wondrous works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children that should be born, which should arise and tell them to their children, that they might put their confidence in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. The children of Ephraim were as archers, handling the bow, that turned back the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God, and refused to walk in his law. And they forgot his doings, and his wondrous works that he had shown them. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He cleaved the sea, and caused them to pass through. He made the waters to stand as a heap. By day also he led them with a cloud, and all the night with the light of fire. He cleaved rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink abundantly as out of the great deep. He brought streams also out of the rock, and caused waters to run down like rivers. Yet went they on still to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And they tried God in their heart, by asking food for their craving. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, Can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock that waters gushed out, and streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Or will he provide flesh for his people? Therefore the Lord heard, and was wroth. And a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also went up against Israel, because they believed not in God, and trusted not in his salvation. And he commanded the skies above, and opened the doors of heaven. And he caused manna to rain upon them for food, and gave them the corn of heaven. Man did eat the bread of the mighty. He set them provisions to the full. He caused the east wind to set forth in heaven, and his power he brought on the south wind. He caused flesh also to rain upon them as the dust, and winged fowl as the sand of the seas. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp round about their dwellings, so that they did eat, and they were filled. And he gave them that which they craved. They were not estranged from their craving. Their food was yet in their mouths. When the anger of God went up against them, and slew of the lustiest among them, and smote down the young men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and believed not in his wondrous works. Therefore he ended their days as a breath, and their years in terror. When he slew them, then they should inquire after him, and turn back and seek God earnestly. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer. But they beguiled him with their mouth, and lied unto him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast with him, neither were they faithful in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgiveth iniquity, and destroyeth not. Yes, many a time doth he turn his anger away, and doth not stir up all his wrath. So he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes away, and comes not again. How often did they rebel against him in the wilderness, and grieve him in the desert? And still again they tried God, and set bounds to the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he redeemed them from the adversary, how he set his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the field of Zoan, and turned the rivers into blood, so that they could not drink the streams. He sent among them swarms of flies, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave over their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to the fiery bolts. He sent forth upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, a sending of messengers of evil. He leveled a path for his anger. He spared not their soul from death. He gave their life over to the pestilence, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. But he made his own people to go forth like sheep. He guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them safely, and they feared not. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to his holy border, to the mountain which his right hand had gotten. He drove out the nations also before them, and allotted them for an inheritance by line. And he made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Yet they tried and provoked God, the Most High, and kept not his testimonies, but turned back and dealt treacherously like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. God heard and was wroth, and he greatly abhorred Israel. And he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, and the tent which he had made to dwell among men. And he delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the adversary's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and his wrath with his inheritance. Fire devoured their young men, and their virgins had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awaked as one asleep, like a mighty man recovering from wine, and he smote his adversaries backward, and he put upon them a perpetual reproach. Moreover, he abhorred the tent of Joseph, and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he hath founded forever. He chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes that give suck, he brought him to be shepherd over Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and led them by the skillfulness of his hands. All right, let's go back up to verse 1. Now this is Maskil of Asaph, and Maskil is the instructions, or that which is instructed by Asaph. Asaph is the gatherer. He is one of the priests. He was one who was chose to lead those that went forth singing before the Lord, playing the instruments, calling to remembrance God's mercy. And we'll find him here doing the same thing. He is. This is an overview, so to speak. Kind of an overview. Overview is something we can kind of look back on. It's a memory, and basically that's what he's going to do. He's going to call these memories up, and we can look back, and sometimes we can get a little bit better understanding with some hindsight. We're going to pick it up here in verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. And this is really a poetic way of saying listen up. My people, let this be a testimony. Let this be some evidence to those that observe God's understanding, God's law, God's knowledge, his wisdom. Because they'll get the most out of it. Incline your ears now to the words of my mouth. Your ears are going to be that which is going to, what the mouth pours out, the ear is kind of like a cup. It takes it in. 2, I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter dark sayings concerning days of old. I will open my mouth with a parable. And we're going to find out this parable here is going to be more like a saying, something that's got some understanding in it. And I will utter dark sayings concerning the days of old. He's going to speak these dark sayings. Dark sayings are, he's going to kind of talk about the negative side here. Not the good times, but the bad times. And that's the darkness. That's kind of like the darkness. Because this is the darkness at that time. That period of time, this was the darkness of it. what they didn't have no understanding, but that has such come into light from that period, and it's going to be concerning the understandings of these old or the past. 3, that which we have heard and known and our fathers have told us. It's about the history, that which we have heard, that which we have known, or found out for ourselves, or maybe our fathers have told us. We've learned from the last generation, so to speak. 4, we will not hide from their children, telling the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength, and his wondrous works that he hath done, and telling about everything that God's done. God's proven himself across the great periods of time. If you just look at it in the proper perspective, it's not really a very hard thing to see. We see how God does work among men, and God has called them by name, so to speak. But this from generation to come, these praises, we're going to tell the next generation. God commanded that. We're going to find this out about his wondrous works. 5, for he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel. And he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children. And he established this testimony. A testimony is a witness. It's a witness. It's somebody. It's that which is going to speak in the court. And he established this in Jacob. And Jacob was the supplanter. Jacob was the one. His name is actually changed to Israel. So this is one and the same. And he appointed a law in Israel. And the law was established firmly. Firmly it was established, and it was made very simple. There, the commandments come forth. There was the 10 in the first, and all of them really just come from those. All law comes from that. It's not a hard thing to understand. You just have to apply yourself to it. And these were those laws which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to the children, that they should teach them to their children, and their children should teach them to their children, and their children to their children. See, because slowly we get this transformation in understanding. See, slowly you receive. It takes several generations to come to the full understanding of God. 6, that the generation to come might know them, even the children that should be born, who should arise and tell them to their children, that the generation to come might know them. That's the ones that ain't born yet, that they should be set firmly, that even the children that should be born, that's these ones that ain't been born yet, and the children after them, and the children after them, that from generation to generation, who should arise and tell their children that it should be perpetual, that the law should be understood forever. And this would work a sign. This works the knowledge of God into the earth. It's kind of like an ointment put on to heal. Healing takes a period of time. Healing just don't come instantly. Well, I'm sure God could do miracles. God can do miracles, so I ain't going to question that. 7, that they might put their confidence in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And it was for this purpose, that they put their confidence in God, put their respect, put their understanding into God, that they shouldn't forget his works. They would be able to remember what he had done. God gave the law in the beginning. And when mankind or humanity reaches that state, I'm sure they eventually will. But at their current rate, it is some ways in their future. Because we'll find out they don't teach these laws to the children. They don't do these things. This is not one of the 10, but it is one of the most important of all God's statutes and commandments that he give. It is one of the commandments, that you teach the law to your children. Because we're going to find out when you don't, they will go astray. They will get lost. Even if you do, they still have free will. And that this was the reason you should teach it to generation. 8, that they would keep his commandments. 8, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation. a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with their God, that they wouldn't be like their fathers. They wouldn't be like this generation before, continuing in their wickedness, continuing in their immorality, continuing in their sin, continuing in their degradations. It's the negative. It's the not good. See, that's the not good, and it comes from not doing good. It comes from not following the law, which is for your own good. Hey, don't want you to be like the generation that don't set their heart aright, that don't apply theirself with some understanding, whose spirit, that's your free will, your spirit is, your spirit's what you control. You got control of it, everything. It's not steadfast with God. It's not steadfast in understanding or applying yourself to achieve the law of God. 9. The children of Ephraim were as archers handling the bow. They turned back in the day of battle. The children of Ephraim. Ephraim can be, we can translate that to fruitful. I usually translate it the double fruited, because we'll find out with knowledge of God they did create an idol. They were as archers handling the bow. They just like these bowmen, these men that handle the bow. They got the bow in hand. They're able to bend it, to draw back and release the arrows. And they turned back in the day of battle. We'll find out, though. They were turned back in the day of battle. They're not able to stand before God. 10. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. They didn't keep the covenant of God. We got this. This is going to be an example we get. It's documented through the building of an alternative altar that come through Jeroboam. This whole lesson, it's a whole subject within itself. How they didn't keep the law of God, how they were turned back, they refused to walk in his law, and they made them idols. 11, and they forgot his doings and his wondrous works that he had shown them. They forgot all about God, and they forgot all about what God had done. See, why? We'll find out. The generation wasn't keeping the law, just like the generation that got lost in the wilderness. They didn't circumcise their children. They didn't teach the law and the ordinances that do away with the wickedness from the heart. 12. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. Marvelous things had God done to make an example, to these things that he did in the sight of their fathers, these examples that God made to the generation before, even in the judgments, even in the land of Egypt. Egypt's that land of holes. It's a land of pits, snares, traps. It was the land of written ordinances and rules and understandings of men, and we find out it come from a long time ago. We're going to get the genealogy of how Egypt got founded, and even in the field of Zoan. The field of Zoan is that place of departure. That's where they were right before they crossed the sea. 13. He cleaved the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters to stand as a heap. And God cleaved the sea. To cleave the sea, and that's those waters that were salted there, that portion of the oceans, all the great waters of the earth. These are those waters that are impure. These are the waters that ain't no good. They're being purified by the salt. And God cleaves them, or he separates them. God separated them. He made a way for them to walk through on dry ground. And it's a very simple thing. They didn't have to this water didn't touch them. They had no problem with it. God brought them out according to the understanding of God's judgments and his law. He made the waters to stand in a heap. He made these waters just to stand in a heap as he brought them out. They were simply following God and his law, his understanding. 14. By day also he led them with a cloud, and all the night with the light of fire. And God led them by day, and through the understanding that there was confusion in the earth. that there was confusion in the earth. And through that, they followed God all the night. And through the darkness, they followed the fire. That's that light coming off, and we know that light is coming from a fire. That light's coming from the judgment of God. These two things here, the confusion and the judgment of God, make known the fact that God actually exists. These are two things that are there for a clear sign. Confusion and judgment. It's these two things that come from the law. 15. He cleaved rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as out of the great deep. He cleaved the rocks. He split the rock. He busted the rock in half. However you want to look at it. But when the water come forth, the rock moved two different ways in the wilderness. And he gave them to drink abundantly as out of the great deep. Just like water coming out of the great deeps of the oceans, except for this water's pure, this water's clean. They come from the rock. This rock is going to be the law of God. It represents the law of God. The understanding comes forth from God's law. 16. He brought streams also out of the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. These streams that come forth out of the rock, and it flowed. It wasn't a little bit of water. We're going to find out it turned into a river. When you're trying to water a million people, over a million people, you just a bucket or two ain't going to get it. 17. Yet went they on still to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. But we'll find out God continued. He did these great works. He did some great works in Egypt and showed them He's a God of judgment, great God of judgment. He brought them forth according to the law. And we'll find out God began to make His example. See, we'll find out they suffered from culturalization, I call it. See, they had become accustomed to the ways of Egypt, these ways of that place, and these things were engraved, so to speak, into them. But they continued to sin, and they rebelled against the Most High in the desert, and that was the wilderness. That was the place where God's law was bringing them forth, washing them clean, going to purge them. 18, and they tried God in their heart by asking food for their craving. And they tried God in their heart by asking food for the craving. And we're going to see here, this is when they wanted flesh. They wanted flesh. God had given them manna, but it really wasn't enough. They thought that, they asked Moses, what's God done? He's going to bring us out here and starve us to death? Because they didn't feel like they was getting any substance, but the substance they was receiving was of a different kind. 19. Yes, they spoke against God, and they said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? What's God going to do? Bring us out here and starve us to death? This is just another way of saying that. Can God feed us out here? Has God got these kind of abilities? 20. Behold, He smote the rock with waters, gushed out, and streams overflowed. Can He give bread also? Or will He provide flesh for His people? Behold, He smote the rock. He gave us some water. He's brought the water forth. We can drink. And waters have come forth, but can He give bread also? Can He nourish the body? Or can He provide flesh for His people? Can He give substance? Which was God going to do, so to speak? Can He provide this bread? Or will He provide flesh for His people? We'll find God had provided the manna, and they wasn't happy with that. They wanted flesh. So God thought that, well, this is a good opportunity to make an example. And that's the way God does. That's the way He works. He takes, just like anybody else, He takes advantage of opportunity. We just want to make sure we give God the correct opportunities. 21. Therefore the Lord heard and was wroth, and a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also went out against Israel. Therefore the Lord heard, God understood, God knew. Remember, God understands. and was wroth. So he decided, and his great compassion releases his anger. God has always got compassion. He's got the understanding to come forth in his judgments. This fire that's kindled against Jacob, we'll find out. This fire that does not devour, the fire that does not burn, this is given. They're standing in the fire, yet they're not consumed by it. Even his anger that's kindled against Israel. Israel's those that contend with the mighty one. And the mighty one they contend with is God's strength in the law. 22, because they believed not in God, and trusted not in his salvation. It's because they didn't believe in God, really. I mean, they didn't trust in the salvation of God. They didn't trust in the fact that God can save. God wanted to bring them down. One good thing about being brought down is you get a good understanding of what lifting up is. 23. He commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And we'll find out. But God in his mercy, he commands the skies above, and he opened the doors of heaven. And he released his blessings anyway. And he caused manna, 24, and he caused manna to rain upon them for food. And he gave them the corn of heaven. And God opened up the heaven and gave them manna. Manna, it says the corn of heaven. It's not the corn of heaven. It's going to be more like bread, more like substance, more like the grain, even, of heaven. And that's kind of like some of the harvest from heaven, or this harvest of understanding. Because, see, God's showing you he has great ability. God has ability to nourish, even in your understanding. 25, man did eat the bread of the mighty. He set them provisions to the full. And man did eat the bread, the substance that nourishes the mighty, or it even gives strength. This is looked on to like that which nourishes God. That which nourishes God. Even there where God gets his substance from, we're going to find out it actually represents the law itself. He sent them provisions to the full. This is all they would need. Everything it would take. 26, he caused the east wind to set forth in heaven, and his power he brought on the south wind. And with this he caused the east wind to set forth in heaven. Heaven's that place of understanding. It's where all understanding exists, this east wind, even the enlightenment that comes from it. When the sun comes up, it brings forth light. Light is always understanding. It's something to make known. It's something to show forth. And this showing forth of the wind, this east wind, that's this understanding that comes forth across the period of time, through the generations, see, of its meaning. His power he brought on the south wind. South wind's that way, that arid place, that dry place, that parched place where we can look for and see the witness for God's judgment in the past through the wind. The wind is a period of time. It's something that blows across. It takes time for it to move. 27. He caused the flesh also to rain upon them as the dust, as the winged fowl, the sand of the seas. He caused the flesh also. And this is going to be that period when they wanted flesh. They wanted flesh. This period where they were still under the cravings, wanting that which, even something from the past which they had. Is what this is. These winged fowls, the sand of the seas. So by the multitudes he poured them on them. We'll find out knee deep. They waded through these fowls, these winged fowls. He let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their dwellings. 28. And that's when he brought all the fowls down. We'll find this craving of flesh that they had. 29. So they did eat, and they were filled, and he gave them that which they craved. So God satisfied their cravings even though God didn't agree with it. God wasn't in full agreement with them, yet he did what they wanted. See, that doesn't matter. You don't have to be in all the understanding of God to know that God's going to do the right thing for you constantly. He's going to do the best things, and sure, you're not going to be without these things of the flesh, but God, in his ultimate mercy, has provided a way, or will provide a way if he hasn't already. 30. They were not estranged from their craving. Their food was yet in their mouths. They were not estranged from this. They were not estranged from the craving. They were not estranged from these things of the flesh, these things that God understands that you got to have some understanding of the flesh. You got to have some understanding for the spirit as well. So God really just made one law that does both things. 31. When the anger of God went up against them, and slew of the lustiest among them, and smote down the young men of Israel. And this is when those that in greed, this lustieth, it kind of refers to the fattest, and that which is those had made gluttons of themselves upon these fowls that God had brought down, all these things that was they were contained, so to speak. They could be outlined, they could be understood. They partook of these till they was sick, till they puked. We find out they devoured and gorged themselves, and that's to be lusty, so to speak, to want more than you need. See, to want more than you need, to think you're not going to get it no more. And he smote the young men of Israel. And we'll find this. We'll find this written and documented. We ain't been through there yet. 32. For all this they sinned still, and believed not in his wondrous works. But even for all this, all the examples God even made with that, when he brought down the fowls of heaven, with all the understanding God made from that, and the examples, and all the great works God was doing, they still continued to sin, because they maybe God was hardening their hearts. Maybe God was making that neck stiff. Maybe they wasn't praying for God to turn their understandings. See, we find that God works like that. 33. Therefore he ended their days as a breath, and their years in terror. And we'll find that's what happened to that generation when they wouldn't go in to inherit the land. God ended their days. It was like nothing. And their years in terror. And their greater understandings ended in terror. We'll find because they were rebellious. There was still some wickedness in them that they wasn't willing to purge out. 34. When he slew them, then they would inquire after him and turn back and seek God earnestly. When he slew them, and God slew that generation, that's when they would turn back and inquire after God. When God, great wrath, come down, and turn back and seek God earnestly. And that's why we're all here, so we can turn back and seek God earnestly. That's going to be the task that's going to be at hand. God making his everlasting example. 35. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer. And this is the place to remember it, that God is your rock. God is the Most High God. There is no other God. He is the one that slayed you. He is the one that will redeem you. God is your Redeemer as well. 36. But they beguiled him with their mouth, and lied unto him with their tongue. But they beguiled him. They tried to trick God. They lied to God. And we'll find out what they done. And they thought they could separate themselves, so to speak, from the judgment of God. 37. Their heart was not steadfast with him, neither were they faithful in his covenant. And their heart wasn't steadfast. It wasn't solid. It wasn't firm. They were not unwavering. They were flip-floppy, so to speak. Neither were they faithful in his covenant. This covenant is a simple agreement. And when you enter into it, it is not a light thing. God says that if you will enter into this covenant, I will give you a reward. That you become a servant of God. God is going to give you your pay. It's a very simple thing, and it's for your own good. It's for your own good. This covenant is really an agreement between the righteous and the wicked, that he slay him not. 39, so we remembered that we were but flesh, a wind that passes away and comes not again. But God, in his mercy, he knows that it's only for a period of time. It's only going to last so long. They're flesh, they pass away, and they ain't coming again. So, it's just a period of time. It's not going to last forever. You're not going to live forever. Not here. See? Not here. We want to keep in mind, though, you can live forever. You can die forever. There's both. There's eternal life. There must be eternal death. 40. How often did they rebel against him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? How often? How often did they rebel against him in the wilderness, grieve him in the desert? 10 times. 10 times. The Lord said, that's it. I think you broke every law I had. So he said, this 10 times, take your turn. And in other words, God's got limits. God's limited it in his mercy. He's only going to put up with so much. Then he's going to wait on the next generation to see the judgments he brought on the last. 41, and still again they tried God and set bounds to the Holy One of Israel. And still again they tried God. This is where they tried to set bounds to the Holy One of Israel. They tried to confine God, to limit his judgment, so to speak, to cause it to rest on somebody else maybe. 42, they remembered not his hand, nor the day when he redeemed them from the adversary. They didn't remember the day God brought them out of Egypt. They didn't remember the day God brought them forth even across the river. They forgot all these things. 43, how he set his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zoan. How God done all his marvelous works in that land of pits, that land of snares and traps, all those written ordinances that men had back then to deceive. Their pantheon of not of gods, these images they made of man, and all the ways they ruled over men through ideology. All the wonders of Zoan, which he did. Zoan's that place of departure. That was where you left from. That's where you crossed through the waters, and that was the place of departure. Simple as that. That's when your feet left the soil there. 44, and they turned the rivers into blood, so that they could not drink their streams. And these were the miracles he did in Egypt. Turned the rivers into blood. The rivers, that which descends, is that understanding coming down. God turns them into blood. It was sin to them, so that they could not drink their streams. They become putrid. Even the drinking of the water was a sin. To take up that understanding they had. It's the same thing. For he sent among them swarms of flies, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. 45. So he sent among them swarms of flies, the multitudes of those things that flitter around, those things that swarm up. It's not a good thing. The flies not. The flies are a pest. The flies are those things that fly around and jump around. They Pascal will find they love devour carcasses. They devour the dead. And that's what they was doing. which devoured them, and these frogs, which destroyed them. Frogs are a they ain't so much as a pestilence as much as something that's unclean, that it kind of represents those creepy little things that creep around and jump around on the ground, and it's an unclean thing. uh, Looking for the right word here, may not find it. uh, Detestable. These frogs represent the detestable things that creep. 46, he gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. Their increased, that's their harvest. That's what they thought they was going to get, or that would more than what they would usually need. He give it to the caterpillar. That's the swarms of locusts, the swarms of the destroyer. And the labor unto the locust, unto the destroyer. So everything they did and everything they thought they was going to get from it was give over for destruction. It wasn't going to be no good to them. 47, he destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He destroyed their vines. Their vines is that which they was going to get their grape juice from, their wine from, that which they was going to get this substance of the fruit. We can look at it like that. Their sycamore trees. That's the fruit trees. That's the wild fruit trees. Were destroyed with frost. God was showing them he's going to starve them. They was going to come to great hunger. He was taking out the fruit trees. The vines he stripped with hail. Hail is the frozen rain, and it really it's coming from a cold place. And when the understanding comes from a cold place, it freezes, it gets hard, it forms hail, and that's the judgment coming down from the understanding. That's the not good rain. 48, he gave over their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to the fiery bolts, and their cattle. The cattle, we can look at it like that's the greater cattle, not the lesser cattle of the flocks, but the greater cattle. These that are herds. These are like herds of. We'll go ahead and look at it. It's their priests. It was their priest of the Egyptians. He also to the hail. He gave over to the judgments of understanding. In other words, their knowledge and wisdom was made to no good. It was turned to that which is destructive, and their flocks to fiery bolts. And their flocks he gave over to these fiery bolts. These were the judgments coming down from God's law that they had from the beginning, that they had distorted. Why? Well, they sons of Noah. We're going to find that out. 49, he sent forth upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath and indignation and trouble, sending of messengers of evil. And he sent forth upon them the fierceness of his anger. They brought it upon themselves, really should be what this says. I mean, by not going according to God's understanding, his knowledge, he gave it from the beginning. Now, don't think the sons of Noah didn't have it, because they did. They had the law as much as they needed. We'll find out at that time there wasn't as much law needed. See, just enough to contain. Just enough to contain is all that's ever needed. But he sent forth his fierceness, his anger, wrath, and indignation. He troubled, sending the messengers of evil. These messengers of evil. These messengers of evil here, we can look at them. They're kind of like these false prophets. These are the speakers of damnation. All they going to do is take you prisoner somehow, lock you up in some understanding, get you trapped, bring you into a furrow, get you down into the crack where you can't get out of. That's all that ever happens from an understanding of men. Understanding is something we got to get for ourselves. We got to go get it from God. He's got it all. 50. He leveled a path for his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. So he levels a path for his anger. God prepared a way. God made a way. He says, if this is the way they want to go, we'll go this way. And he makes a way for his anger. He channels it, in other words. He don't spare their soul from death. In other words, He going to give that soul the ability to die, to know what that is. He gives their life over to pestilence, and he gives over to their life to pestilence. He's going to give their some trouble. He's going to give you some trouble in your life. Why? Well, you don't follow God's understanding. You don't keep yourself in His knowledge. 51. This is the same thing God did to them. See, this is the same thing God did to Egypt. The same thing. There's no difference. God's the same. From one era to another, from one generation to another, God's mercy is forever. Turn. That's all you got to do. 51. He smote all the firstborn of Egypt, first fruits of his strength, and the tens of Ham. And he smote all the firstborn of Egypt, that place of pits, snares, lies, traps, understandings of men, take you in, make you prisoners, to every not a god, every half god, half man you could ever think of. Well, almost. Of course, there would be those that would come along and think of some more, some new ones that nobody else ever thought of. But he smote the firstborn. He smote those that come forth from the tents of Ham. Those dwelling places of Ham. Ham was the son of Noah. Ham means to get hot. That was heated up. In other words, God brought them by the same way, through that same path of judgment. Making an example, like God always does. It's a very simple thing. This little history lesson to make it known. 52. But he made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He made his own people. That was that remnant God brought there to make an example of in the first place. He brings them out like sheep, guided them through the wilderness like a flock. God bringing his remnant forth constantly. God bringing his remnant forth. Even separating one for himself to make an example, so he would have one to bring forth. 53. And he led them safely, and they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And God brought them on out. This is like a relapse of what we just went through. And God brought them out of Egypt by a mighty hand, like only God could do. And he smote their enemies behind them by the sea. And the sea overwhelmed them, and all that understanding that men have just kind of swept them away. 54. And he brought them to his holy border, to the mountain which his right hand had got. God brought them forth to that holy mountain, to that place God separating to him for himself, that mountain, or his holy border. God brought him forth to this holy border. That was to a border is an edge, a outline, and God brought him forth to it to know this is the place that separates. This is the place of separation. It's that law of God. To the mountain. That's the mound that everything's built on. See, the last generation, there underneath the mound, and God's just stacking it up. This mountain. That's that place God made for Himself, that His right hand had got. See, it's by His great works, by His strength. Even by the examples God's made throughout time. 55. He drove out the nations also before them, and allotted them for an inheritance by line. Made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. He drove out all the other nations from before them. As they come forth into the land, God did just that. And He went before them. And He gave them abilities. He gave all the ability come from God, and He allotted them an inheritance by line, by measure. God laid it out, measured it out. Even that inheritance, that which you was going to get from God. He made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. And He caused Israel, that's those that contend with the mighty one, to dwell in their tents, these places where they will abide. And that's where we find them today. Nobody's going anywhere. 56, yet they tried and provoked God, the Most High, and kept his testimonies. So they tried. They provoked God, the Most High. Not understanding that God has all the knowledge and wisdom and understanding. You can't get out of these things. It's just something you're going to have to do, something that has to be done, and it's for your own good. And they didn't keep his testimonies, and that's what we're talking about, not keeping the law of God. These testimonies, those examples he's made from era to era. Now we search through the rocks and dust trying to make sense of it all. It's really pretty simple. If we ain't careful, someday they're going to be searching through the dust and rocks looking for us. 57. But turned back and dealt treacherously like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. They didn't keep his commandments back then. Saying God's trying to teach you something. But they turned back. They dealt treacherously like their fathers. They did like the generation before them. They got off on a good foot. But they said, where's this getting us? And they turned back. They went backwards again. They dealt treacherously, continued in the sin, continued. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. Turned aside, brought by a different path. They went off to a little side shoot there. Maybe I've mentioned that before. A little side shoot that goes off the main path. Like a deceitful bow. A deceitful bow is a bow that has no strength. It's a pretty good looking bow, but it got no power in it. It's deceitful. It's going to break if you draw it back too far. 58. For they provoked him with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. And that's what they did. That's what they did. And I believe we're referring to that period where they make the graven images. See, they stand up something else. This is to represent God. God don't need no representation. God represents himself. See, God represents himself from generation to generation as the power, the might. See, you either do good or you'll do bad. It's really pretty simple. 59. God heard, was wroth, and he greatly abhorred Israel. But God heard, God knows, God understands, because of their graven images, because it's a sign that you don't know who God is. If you got to have something in front of you, it's a clear understanding, a clear sign, a projection right into reality that you do not comprehend who God is. It's clearness. 60. And he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, and the tent which he had made to dwell among men. And that's what God did. He forsook the tent there in Shiloh. Shiloh was that place of rest, that place where God had brought them. They had finally the place of all blessing, the place of goodness. This was the promised land, the tent which he made to dwell among men. That dwelling place, that example, God brought them there and caused them to be there. But we'll find out it didn't last long. Same example we got in Eden. See, when God created man in the beginning, it didn't last long. We'll find. Men get in there. They want to distort God's understanding. They want to take it up for themselves somehow, think they can control it. You think you can sit on, it's like a horse and control the great God with strength and with a bridle somehow. I wouldn't try that. 61. And he delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the adversary's hand. So what's he do? He delivered his strength into captivity. And that's what God does. You think you can control it, but you're not in control. God's in control. God's going to control all things. It's a lesson he will keep teaching over and over. Even if he has to deliver his glory into the adversary's hand. 62. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. And he gave his people over also into the sword, into the war, into judgment, into the battle, into the word, which he commanded from the beginning, and captivity, making example out of them, making examples out of them. He was angry with his inheritance. See, he wasn't happy with what was going on. So God made an example. God says, if you want to go that way. But you're going to be coming back. You can believe that. See, when you get your belly full, when you've had all you can take, you'll turn back to God. 63. Fire devoured their young men, and their virgins had no marriage song. Fire of judgment come down, devoured their young men. Young men, it's a beautiful, wonderful thing to be young and full of youth and strength. It'd be a good thing that if we could just be born with all the understanding and knowledge of God and wisdom we need. Maybe we were. But their virgins had no marriage song. Why, God had cut off the young men. There was no marriage. The virgins, these ones that had not known men. See, there was nobody with understanding to come forth. There's those of strength, but nobody with good knowledge and understanding to come forth and bear fruit, bear seed unto God, show that they were mighty men. 64, their priest fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Their priest fell by the sword. That was their anointed ones. That's their anointed ones. That's these ones that received the knowledge and wisdom and understanding from God to make sure everybody kept it, to make sure everybody got it. They fell by the sword. They fell also in the battle by the word. And their widows made no lamentations. They didn't cry for them because they know that this was the judgment of God. This was the judgment of God. They'd lost their husband. Their caretaker, their tender had been taken away. 65, then the Lord awaked as one asleep, like a mighty man recovering from wine. Then the Lord awoke. He woke up then as one who was asleep, if we want to look at it like that. Then like a mighty man who was recovering from wine. Like somebody who had to kind of get his senses together a little bit. Somebody had to come too quickly and take full charge. We might say it like that. 66, and he smote his adversaries backward. He put them a perpetual reproach. And he smote back his adversaries. He smote back the enemies. Because God has that ability. See, you might think you got it all figured out. We'll find out. God does. God's got it all figured out. He is the one that does. And he turns them backwards. And we'll find out they just turn around. They go back the way they was coming. Instead of coming against God's understanding, he put them in a perpetual reproach. Constantly backing up, backing it up, back it up. See, backing up. That's really what it is. You're just constantly backing up. Going backwards. Oh, you're looking towards God, saying, oh yeah, God, we're going backwards away from God the whole time. 2067. Moreover, he abhorred the tent of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim. Moreover, he abhorred the tent of Joseph. That was the one. That was that which God had added. That was the increase of the flock in the beginning. Even the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, those that caused to forget, the Ephraim's the double-fruited. But double-fruited, why? They had their eyes on God and they raised up images. We got the example. This is the work of God. This is what God done. God make an example through time, trying to show himself, trying to magnify himself. 68, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. But he chose the tribe of Judah. Judah, that's where Mount Zion was. That's the place where God loves, that Mount Zion. That's that mound. That mound I spoke of. It's stacked up on generations past. built on top of, the from generation to generation, that place, that parched place. It's made an example. It's set there. It's for a post. That's something. That's an identifier, and we should be able to see that pretty clearly. 69, and he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he had founded forever. And that's where God established his sanctuary. That's how God established that place that was sanctified to the heights. Nobody can achieve that because God's still making an example. He's still stacking it up. Like the earth, which he had founded forever. And it's just like the earth, which he had founded forever. We'll find out in his mercy. God did that in his mercy. 70. He chose David also, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. And he chose David. David is the beloved. And we're going to find out this is when they get their king. His servant. He's going to be God's servant. God has many, many, many servants. Many servants. We can call them the anointed ones. Some people think we're waiting on a Messiah. I don't know if the Messiah's singular. We'll find out there have been many Messiahs. Messiahs upon Messiahs. There's been anointed ones upon anointed ones. God, the ones God picks to do his work. But he took David from among the sheepfolds. And the sheepfolds, that means he was tending the sheep. He was a shepherd boy. We got the story. It's documented. God's going to use him, for example. He's kind of one of the lowliest. He's just a servant out there tending the flock, sleeps in the open field. 71. And from following the ewes that give suck, he brought him to be shepherd over Jacob and his people, Israel, and Israel his inheritance. And he was following the ewes that give suck, and these are the mama lambs, or the mama sheep. They give suck, or they nurse. They nurse the lambs. They let the baby lambs suck or nurse the milk, that which gives substance from their mother. But these are of the flock, these ewes are. And he brought him to make him a shepherd instead of over those ewes that give suck, to be the shepherd over Jacob, his people. Kind of like the ewes that give suck in that flock, see? And Israel his inheritance. God caused David to rule over them. 72. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and led them by the skillfulness of his hand. And we'll find out he did. He shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart. Best he could do. The best he could do. According to what he knew, what he understood, is that God has great mercy. God is merciful. God is always merciful. God is great. God is powerful in his acts. That's the integrity we found. He led them by the skillfulness of his hands, by his abilities, and by the skills which God gave him. See, all skill comes from God. All things come from God. God makes all examples. God calls them by name. God does it all. When we serve God, we are acting as a proxy, so to speak, a deputy, like a deputy of the sheriff, so to speak. Not that you should go around laying in wait, causing as much trouble or trying to seek it out that you can bring and make people offenders. Like I stated, the purpose of the law is not to punish, really, or to bring exactions, but just to simply just make the error known. And then we should all do the right thing, right? We're going to move forward. Psalm 79. Turn and return.